All right. Thank you, everyone, for joining us this morning or afternoon, depending on what time zone you're joining us from. We want to welcome you to our next round of our summer webinar series, preparing for the EU packaging and packaging waste recycling regulation August deadline. We're really excited to have you join this morning. We have a lot to talk about. This deadline is coming up very soon, and this is a regulation that I think a number of companies that are obligated to meet the requirements likely have overlooked this first deadline, as this is a regulation that goes into effect in waves, and this first round of obligations begin in just a couple of weeks here. So we're going to walk through what this first round of obligations entail, and then we'll open it up to Q&A as usual. So if you have any questions throughout this webinar, for folks who haven't been joining us throughout the summer, there is a Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. You can enter questions anonymously or with your name attached. Feel free to do that throughout the session, and we'll try to get to as many questions as we can by the end of the webinar. If there are any that we don't get to, we will try to follow up with you individually, or you can reach out to us. We'll include our contact information at the end of the session. So let's get started.
Great. Thanks, Marissa. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us for this very timely topic. Just as a means of kicking us off, Sourcemap is the supply chain mapping software company. We have been helping companies to implement workflows to automate compliance with supply chain due diligence regulations for 5 years, and for supply chain mapping and transparency for 15 years. But we are not a legal advice provider. So as a disclaimer, this presentation is provided for general information and educational purposes to help you all understand the law. Of course, we're happy to field any questions you may ask us in the chat during this session and afterwards. But we are not lawyers, and you will always have to refer back to your legal counsel when you make any decisions based on this information in order to comply with this regulation.
Great. And one other thing I just wanted to add here, for folks who are perhaps new to PPWR or are not totally familiar on all of the obligations and sort of the phases in which these obligations go into effect. The information we'll be discussing in this webinar only refer to the reporting obligations required by the August 12th deadline. The EU packaging and packaging waste regulation. This is a regulation, as I said, that rolls out in phases between 2026 and 2030. So there are additional details here regarding its requirements that may change after the regulation has already entered into force. This information, as Leo said, reflect our understanding as of the date of this webinar, so they should not be relied upon as a definitive statement of legal obligations. So just wanted to make that super clear. This is, again, a regulation that goes into effect in stages, and we're focusing during this webinar on the obligations that go into effect in a couple of weeks. Well, we will mention the 2028 and 2030 obligations as well.
And just so you know who you're talking to, we are hosting a series of webinars through the summer, just about every 2 weeks, on different topics: EUDR, EU forced labor and US forced labor regulation, and then now the packaging and packaging waste regulation. I'm the founder and CEO of Sourcemap, so I've been at it for about 15 years, and I'm bringing experience on the workflow and tech side of the compliance success factors. And then Marissa.
Yes, so I am the Senior Director of Policy and Government Affairs at Sourcemap. I have been at Sourcemap for about 5.5 years now. I manage all of our relationships in Brussels and, of course, on the Hill on the US side. And so I will be leading our discussion on the regulatory requirements for PPWR, as well as, of course, answering the policy-related questions that any of you might have throughout this webinar. Great. Okay, so let's dive in. Just as a very, very brief overview before we get into the weeds. Again, for folks who are perhaps new to PPWR, maybe this is your first time hearing about it. Hopefully it's not, because August 12th is right around the corner. But PPWR is a regulation that, as we've said, it goes into effect in phases. It is primarily a disclosure regulation. I'll talk a little bit more about what we mean by that in a moment. But it enters into force on August 12th. The first phase, I should say, enters into force on August 12th. It covers all packaging that's placed on the EU market, whether you are an EU-based company or based outside of the EU. If you're placing packaging on the EU market, you are subject to PPWR. So that August 12th deadline, the first round of obligations, which we'll be diving into this morning, require operators, economic operators, which again we'll define here, to disclose the composition of the packaging that they're placing on the EU market, and to submit a declaration of conformity, which we will define. We'll talk about what that looks like. We will. Oh,
Sorry.
you can go to the next slide, Leo. So just to look a little bit at what this timeline looks like. The regulation officially went into force in 2025, but the general application, the first round of obligations, and again, what we're focusing on today, is this August 12th deadline, this reporting deadline, this data collection deadline, and this disclosure deadline is really how we'll be referring to this. The declaration of conformity for all of the packaging types that are placed on the EU market. And then in addition to the declaration of conformity, as part of the disclosure of the materials that make up the packaging, there are also limitations for substances of very high concern per Article 5. So again, we'll talk about what these are, but just as a brief overview before we dive into the details of substances of very high concern, there are particular substances on the EU side where there are limitations in terms of how much of that substance can be present in the packaging that is placed on the EU market. And so as part of the PPWR requirements and the disclosure obligation under PPWR, operators must ensure that their packaging contain lower than the amount of those substances of very high concern prior to placing that packaging on the market. If any obligations of PPWR are not met, there is, of course, the risk that that packaging will be pulled from the EU market. There is the opportunity for remediation after that has occurred, but this is intended to be a regulation that ensures not just that packaging is sustainable, recyclable when possible, but also that it is safe, that substances are not exceeding the limitations that have been set on the EU side. So very important to really take note of the disclosure obligations that are required by this August 12th deadline. Otherwise, there is a risk that your packaging will be pulled or withheld from the EU market. The elements of the obligations for PPWR that we're not going to dive into detail today, because these are the longer term obligations, are the harmonized labeling obligations, which are the labeling obligations for the specific, I guess, the packaging on the packaging, the labeling that's required under the law per Article 12. That goes into effect in 2028. And then in 2030, there are obligations around grades and content for recyclability. Long term, 2038, there is the possibility that the grades may be tightened even further. But again, 2028 and 2030 should really be the dates that you're focused on in terms of the next two rounds of obligations in terms of the total timeline for PPWR. So we'll dive in now into what exactly is a declaration of conformity, and what this looks like. And also we can talk a little bit about who might have this in your supply chain. Um, the Declaration of Conformity is essentially well, this slide we wanted to break down sort of what type of data is in a Declaration of Conformity, and also the type of information again that is writ large required by this August 12th deadline. These include the packaging bill of materials, essentially all of the materials that are, or disclosing all of the materials that are making up that packaging that's being placed on the EU market. This is really important, not just when we're talking about ensuring that the substances of concern do not exceed the limitations that the EU has set, but this also plays into the recyclability obligations for PPWR in the long term, because of course there are certain materials that are not recyclable. And so if there's packaging that you're placing on the market that might be primarily a recyclable material, but then it contains additional materials that are not recyclable, that needs to be disclosed as part of the Declaration of Conformity, as part of the PPWR requirements, to ensure that it is clear whether or not the packaging is fully recyclable. And anything you want to add there, Leo, just around the disclosures around the bill of materials?
I think the only thing that we've seen implementing this for customers is this, that the much of this data lies actually in the suppliers, with your packaging suppliers. So
Mhm.
most of our customers have not actually, who are actually responsible for the Declaration of Conformity, have not actually ever collected most of this information. And it's not a lot of information, but it's entirely within your packaging suppliers. And so the first step is to go get it from them.
Exactly. And we'll talk again a little bit about the type of data that, as we get to the Q&A function or section of this webinar, we'll talk about the type of data that operators should be expected to maintain as part of PPWR requirements, even if this is data that's not necessarily being disclosed to the EU. And part of that is the traceability of your product, so that in the event that you are audited by competent authorities, you have that record. But as Leo said, the expectation here is that while the operator is the entity that is responsible for PPWR requirements, they're collecting this information from their suppliers, from their upstream suppliers. And even the Declaration of Conformity, the operator, the entity that is actually responsible and liable in the event of non-compliance for PPWR, may not necessarily be the entity that has the Declaration of Conformity document. A supplier further upstream may have that Declaration of Conformity. There only needs to be a one Declaration of Conformity, as long as there is one, and the entity that is responsible, the economic operator, has validated that that Declaration of Conformity is present. They have signed off that this is valid, this is real. Again, that economic operator is the one that is responsible and liable for PPWR requirements. But as we've seen, many companies are collecting this further upstream if they are not the ones that ultimately have that document. Again, we talked a little bit about the restricted substances and heavy metals. So this is an element of PPWR where evidentiary documents come into play. So there are disclosure obligations around restricted substances and heavy metals to ensure that your packaging, again, does not exceed those strict requirements under under EU law. What is also important to collect as part of this data collection process from your suppliers is any sort of evidentiary documentation pertaining to those substances or heavy metals. So, whether or not, just whether that is an attestation that this substance does not exceed the amount that has been set by the EU, and this has been signed off on, whether it is documentation proving that this has been tested, and this is the actual amount of the heavy metals or substances that are present in the packaging, and here is the proof. This is really where the evidentiary documentation can come into play. And again, the objective here is to ensure that there is effectively an audit trail in the event that competent authorities audit your packaging or your supply chain to ensure that that packaging has met PPWR obligations. Anything else you want to add there, Leo, before we keep moving?
No, just starting to see the questions come in, and we'll address those, by the way, we have a Q&A section coming up in just a couple of slides.
Great.
I do want to cover the workflow implementation. With these regulations, we see an attempt to do it by hand, and certainly if you have just a handful of packaging types, this is something you can probably do more or less ad hoc. As soon as you get into the dozens and hundreds and thousands of packaging types, the workflows do get very complicated, mostly because you have to have a validated declaration of conformity for every type of packaging that your company puts on the market. So it very quickly, if you have multiple manufacturing sites, each one of them may have their own packaging suppliers. You could very quickly get into an untenable situation where you're collecting data via email and attachments, and you cannot easily keep track of whether you've collected all the required data. Certainly, validating it and then signing the declarations then becomes very difficult to do. So in the event that you start to run into workflow limitations because you're trying to do this by hand, this is first and foremost a supply chain due diligence activity. It does need to be run with buy-in from procurement and from the relationship holders with your suppliers. Again, most companies don't keep track of the bills of materials of their packaging. Certainly the metal testing and the PFAS testing data and the REACH data for packaging remains usually in the hands of your packaging suppliers. So onboarding those suppliers, making sure that they know about the regulation, especially if they're not EU based, is one of the most important steps in complying. Usually, once they're informed about the regulation and what they need to do, the actual work is very minimal. They just need to find the right person at the packaging supplier that has access to this information, which usually is either in quality, in operations. It's held in a product information management system of some kind, and a quality assurance system of some kind. So onboarding those suppliers is an important part of PPWR, although it's not part of the regulation. It's certainly something that we've seen people need help with, and we have a whole team that specializes in doing this. Collecting the data in a structured manner that is not an email attachment becomes very important because you need to collect certain documents as evidence along the way, and certain data in formats that make sense, quantities, concentrations, and the like. So having a structured data request really helps to streamline the process, mostly for your suppliers. Then it also, of course, helps to track the completion and the compliance. Therefore, if you've collected all the right documents and the thresholds haven't been exceeded in terms of toxic materials, you are compliant, basically. The ability to follow up with suppliers and make sure that they provide the right data, that they can provide complete and accurate information. In some cases, they may not need to provide test results, but they will need to provide an attestation as to why they don't need to provide test results. If they're preparing test results because the packaging won't be on the market for some time, they can also provide that. So there is a little bit of back and forth that we've experienced with some of the suppliers with more transitional programs, and validation of all that data, ensuring completeness, preparing a declaration of conformity, which really means taking the packaging information that you've most likely collected from your suppliers and validating that it's complete and putting it in a searchable archive we would recommend always something that's audit ready, so that you can point a finger at saying who provided the data, when they provided it, who signed off on it, and when. This could be, as with all of these regulations, the horizon for investigations and enforcement is unclear. It certainly could be months or years after the data was collected, and by that time, your packaging may no longer be the same. The suppliers may no longer be the same. The supply chain will certainly have changed, and so it's important to have all this data archived in a coherent way. And then something that always gets missed in these compliance workflows is that supply chains change, especially supply chains for accessories like packaging. And that means there's going to be new material suppliers that feed into the supply chain. You can expect 10 to 20% turnover in any supply chain on an annual basis. The suppliers need to be informed that they need to notify you if their supply chain changes and provide a new information on the packaging type for you to file a new declaration of conformity. But also, we will do certainly is go out and remind them to update their information if there's anything that has changed, and it often does change. So supply chains are not static. Anything here, Marissa, that strikes you?
No, I think that this is, really comprehensive. One thing that I will just add or reiterate is I think the advantage of PPWR is that, unlike some other, I would argue, more cumbersome regulations like EUDR, PPWR can really be incorporated into your data collection and supply chain mapping process with your suppliers. Because there are so many other EU regulations that, while they may have more robust supply chain mapping obligations than PPWR, because some of these other regulations actually very explicitly require disclosure of the supply chain map in a way that PPWR really just requires retention of that information rather than disclosing that directly to competent authorities. That's how this is written in the adopted text. This is a regulation where this type of data collection can be incorporated into your mapping process, provided that you have a robust supply chain mapping and data collection process established. Really, what is important, again, just to reiterate, is the turnaround time for this particular set of obligations for PPWR for folks who have not been tracking this and do place packaging on the market, on the EU market. It is really important to take this August 12th deadline very seriously and ensure that you are prepared, because this is a strict deadline, and it's important to make sure that you're compliant by August 12th, that you're not just starting by August 12th. So that's all I would add there.
Just before, and to underscore what you just said, Marissa, and before we go to the Q&A, it is much more effective. So we've seen companies that are doing supply chain due diligence for forced labor compliance, for deforestation compliance, for general corporate due diligence, but also for tariffs. If you have such a program that is already able to collect structured data, it's much easier to fold the PPWR requests for information into that process, because it shares just so many commonalities in terms of collecting bill of materials data from suppliers in a structured way, and that really streamlines, getting the right contact person at the supplier, getting them informed and educated as to how to upload the data in the right format, how to handle quality control issues, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm just flashing up this slide, but we use this as a way to organize customers who have multiple regulatory reporting obligations, to say, look, there are common threads here between a wide variety of these regulations. In particular, I think the digital product passport, and then obviously the EU deforestation regulation. But these commonalities are best treated together. It's a way to disturb your procurement teams less, your suppliers less, and get all the data that compliance needs early, which is also key. although it may not be possible for the August 12th deadline in this particular case. But we can, of course, talk about these at length beyond this call. So if you're interested in how something could be set up that handles multiple regulatory reporting requirements with one single supplier data collection platform, let us know. And I'll switch back to the Q&A, Marissa.
Great. Okay, so I know we already have a number of questions in the Q&A function of the chat. Thank you so much for using that. We're excited to get to those questions. I first want to start with some of these frequently asked questions that we've heard from other operators that are subject to PPWR. These are some of and some of these cover a couple of the questions that I'm already seeing in the chat. But these are some really important questions that I think folks should ensure you have the answer to prior to August 12th. So I just want to start with these, and then we'll jump into questions that we're getting from the audience. So our first and second question are actually interrelated, so I'm going to answer both of these simultaneously. But who is responsible for ensuring all packaging has met PPWR requirements? And part two to that, who is considered the packaging manufacturer? Is there only one manufacturer per supply chain? So to answer this question, I do want to pull some of the adopted text from PPWR to make very clear how this is defined by the EU. So economic operators, of course, are the ones that should ensure that packaging complies with the requirements. The law states they should take appropriate measures to ensure such compliance in relation to their respective roles in the supply chain. The manufacturer, though, would be the one having detailed knowledge of the design and production process that's best placed to carry out the Declaration of Conformity, which was the document that we described in detail earlier in this session, under this regulation. The Declaration of Conformity should be considered the sole responsibility and obligation of the manufacturer. To clarify what this means as it's written in the adopted text, just based on what we said earlier, this doesn't necessarily mean that the manufacturer is the only one that would have the Declaration of Conformity. It means that they are the one that bears legal responsibility for ensuring that the Declaration of Conformity is present. So just making that super clear. The manufacturer is not always the only entity in the supply chain that would have that Declaration of Conformity, but they are the ones who are legally liable under PPWR. In the adopted text, it's made very clear there should be only one manufacturer per packaging supply chain per the definitions established in the law, meaning the manufacturer is the one that is responsible here. For ensuring that PPWR obligations are met, for ensuring that the Declaration of Conformity is present. The suppliers of packaging or packaging materials provide the manufacturer with all of the information and documentation necessary so that the manufacturer can demonstrate the conformity of the packaging and the packaging materials. That information and documentation can be provided in either paper or electronic form. Again, just to reiterate, this information is being collected from your upstream supply chain, as well as there's also the expectation under PPWR that in addition to the data that must be disclosed under PPWR, the economic operator should be retaining the information around the supply chain of its packaging in the event that they get audited by competent authorities. While that supply chain map is not part of the disclosure requirements for, again, this August 12th deadline for PPWR in general, the expectation is that that information would be retained just as part of PPWR requirements, again, in the event of an audit, while it is not a legal requirement for disclosure. Another really important thing to note in terms of the definition of a manufacturer is if you are an entity who places products on the market that are packaged under your own name, so under the name of your business, or trademarked or modified in a way that would affect compliance with the regulation, this then makes that operator the manufacturer, and then they should assume responsibility for the manufacturer's obligations. I want to just drill down on this specific definition in a little bit more detail because I saw a couple of questions in the chat related to this. This means that if we're talking about packaged food, for example, that is branded, where the packaging around the food is branded, the operator that is manufacturing that packaging with the branding, that is considered the manufacturer that's responsible for PPWR requirements, the Declaration of Conformity per this definition. So just to make super clear, this doesn't mean that the PPWR requirements are only the responsibility of companies that make packaging alone. And that's it. That's the only product they're placing on the market. You can still be subject to PPWR requirements if you are placing products on the market that are packaged with your own branding and are trademarked. So that is a really important definition here that really broadens the definition of the manufacturer, and it really broadens the amount of economic operators that are subject to PPWR. Again, it's not just companies that their sole product that they're placing on the market is packaging alone. So I just want to make that super clear. Again, I saw a couple of questions related to that in the chat. And then finally, just on the topic of supply chain mapping, just to jump around a little bit here, the way that this is written in the adopted text, I just want to pull this quote out. Ensuring packaging's traceability throughout the whole supply chain facilitates the market surveillance authority, so the competent authorities, that's how they're referred to in the adopted text. The market surveillance authority's task of tracing economic operators who placed on the market or made available on the market non-compliant packaging. The economic operator should therefore be required to keep the information on their transactions for a certain period of time. So again, as I said, while you're not, as the economic operator, submitting a map of your full packaging supply chain directly to the economic operators, in the adopted text, there is very clearly a note that if you were audited by economic operators, there's an expectation that you have a traceable supply chain and that you've maintained a record of particularly the transactions within your supply chain to maintain that traceability. Okay, the next question that we have on here that we've received many times are, what are the packaging types and who determines the packaging types? I'll open this question and then Leo, I'm sure you may have some notes you want to add here. But I want to actually just compare this with EUDR. PPWR is not like the EU deforestation regulation, where EUDR has in the annex of the regulation, you can look up the full list of HS codes that are subject to EUDR. If your HS code is not included in the annex, your commodity, your derived product is not subject to EUDR obligations. Very clear, very straightforward. It's either in the annex or it's not. For PPWR, there is no list of 8 packaging HS codes that are or are not in scope. All packaging that's placed on the EU market is subject to PPWR requirements. The packaging types are essentially describing what the packaging is made of. So this is not some set list that is some static list, I should say, that all economic operators would be pulling from the exact same packaging types in terms of their descriptions of their packaging. This would be something that is determined by the economic operator. It is meant to be descriptive. And again, there is intended to be or required, there's a declaration of conformity per packaging type. So this is something, again, that is determined by the responsible party under PPWR, the economic operator. Leo, is there anything you wanted to add there just around what we're seeing with companies that are starting to compile their data for PPWR around packaging types?
No, the packaging type discussion is a little bit open-ended, but I'm seeing some questions about, does it pertain to the SKU of the finished good? No. Generally, our customers are grouping them in types in in the conventional way that you think of them, like cardboard packaging, vacuum packaging, shrink wrap. So they're grouping them into functional areas or categories of packaging, as opposed to having one declaration for each output SKU or one declaration for each serial number or exact line item number of packaging that you buy. So they're really grouping them into families.
Great. Great. Next question we have on here is what are the EU's substances of very high concern and where can they be found? So if you look up ECHA, the ECHA chemicals database, you can find the list of substances of very high concern, the candidate list for those substances of very high concern. Published by the EU. It's a fairly long list, but these are, as we've stated, substances where strict limitations have been established regarding the amount of that substance that can be present in packaging, particularly when we're talking about food grade packaging. Again, all packaging types are subject to PPWR. So we're including in here packaging that is food grade, that is where the requirements or the concern, I should say, around substances that may be in contact with food is very important. So these substances of very high concern, you can find this list again, the ECHA chemicals database. If anyone has trouble finding this, please just reach out to me and follow up. I'm happy to send this link, but you can find the full list of the substances of very high concern there. And you can also find what the limitations are for each of those substances. Okay. Does PPWR data collection also require collection of evidentiary documentation? This is related to the substances of very high concern question. So there are, as part of the substances limitation requirement under PPWR, the expectation that at the very least you are attesting to the fact that those substances, the threshold has not been exceeded for those substances. So again, whether that documentation that you are collecting pertaining to those substances is evidence in terms of the testing of those materials, or it is an attestation of some sort, that would all count as evidentiary documentation. So again, as we've sort of reiterated, it is important with all EU regulations to think about the maintenance of an audit trail to ensure that you are prepared if there is an audit by competent authorities, making sure that you have all of that evidentiary documentation to prove that you actually have checked, or that someone in your supply chain, not necessarily you as the individual manufacturer, are carrying out these tests on your own, but that there is an attestation that these substances have been tested. Okay, if a packaging material does not meet PPWR requirements, is it permanently banned from the EU market? No, I mentioned this earlier. It would be banned from the EU market in the short term, of course, but there is the option for remediation under PPWR. So this doesn't mean that if there is a ban on a product that you're sort of blacklisted as an economic operator for the rest of time. There is the option for remediation, as there is often the option under many EU regulations. But if there is evidence of non-compliance under PPWR, your packaging would be banned from the EU market until that remediation has occurred. Can more than one entity or supplier in your supply chain have a declaration of conformity for your packaging? I think we've answered this earlier in the webinar, but yes, I mean, you're only submitting the one declaration of conformity, and again, your per packaging type, I should say, and you as the manufacturer, the economic operator, are the one that is legally responsible for that declaration of conformity. But as we've said, in some cases, the manufacturer has the declaration of conformity. They don't need to get it from their upstream suppliers. In some cases, they may need to collect this from their upstream suppliers. They may not have the declaration of conformity themselves. But the way that this is written in the law is the manufacturer either has to be the one who has or creates the declaration of conformity or signs off on the declaration of conformity. So if it is collected from another entity in your supply chain, again, still the one economic operator, the manufacturer, is the one that's legally responsible. How will PPWR be enforced? This is still a little bit of an open question in terms of whether or not competent authorities would go into a full audit in terms of actually testing products. For the time being, because this is a disclosure regulation, products need to have the declaration of conformity. They need to show and demonstrate they've collected the data that they're required to collect, and they've demonstrated that they have the declaration of conformity. If packaging does not have those elements, again, we're talking about the August 12th deadline only in response to this question, then that would be evidence of non-compliance. Competent authorities could therefore take action to withdraw that packaging from the market. Whether there will be robust testing of packaging remains to be seen. But again, remember that the packaging and packaging waste regulation also relates to food grade packaging, and so testing does come into play when food grade packaging is in the mix. So there is a possibility that that may be part of the audit process. It remains to be seen. We'll see after August 12th what that enforcement fully looks like from competent authorities. Great. I'm going to skip the last question just because we sort of touched on this in the timeline slide, and I know we're getting a lot of questions in the chat. I just want to make sure we don't run out of time. So, Leigh, I don't know if there's any to start with
Yeah,
here.
let me give you a little breather. So there was a number of questions around B2B packaging in the Q&A. Yeah, B2B packaging is absolutely covered by the PPWR, and so the same rules apply for B2B packaging. The only substantial carve out is reusable B2B packaging, so things like pallets that get picked up and reused. But otherwise, B2B packaging does need to adhere to the same rules. The difference is that very often it's the packaging supplier or a distributor or an importer or some intermediary in the supply chain that's actually responsible for it. So you're not responsible for the B2B packaging if you're receiving products and then discarding that packaging. The person who sold you that product in the packaging is the one that is responsible. So it does shift upstream one tier, but it typically shifts upstream one tier, but it is absolutely covered by the PPWR. The other, so I'm seeing a family of questions around the labeling requirements. So there's so when the PPWR goes into full effect in 2028 and 2030, the packaging labeling requirements are pretty significant because then there needs to be a whole new generation of recycling and recyclability and recycled content disclosure on products via printed text or via QR codes. But for now, in the very short term, the requirement is that the packaging can be traced back to the manufacturer. So basically to the filer of the declaration of conformity. And so that it seems like it is mostly having to do with the name of the manufacturer and an contact information, basically an address, although there is some mention of a sort of an identifier of the packaging itself, batch, serial number, style. We take it as right now we're interpreting that as that there has to be some way for the person who receives the packaging to be able to find out where the declaration of conformity is for that packaging. So if different packaging types have completely different origins, and you need to um, demarcate them. But usually, just knowing what product it is, the batch of the product itself, not the packaging, and the manufacturer and the manufacturer contact information, which I think they put in here because it's information that is available on a lot of consumer packaging, obviously not on all consumer packaging. And so then a QR code is potentially necessary if you need to add all this information and more to comply with PPWR going forward. We also got a whole series of questions about what kind of packaging is covered and what kind is not. I like the question about sausage casing in particular. Um, but broadly speaking, if the packaging is actually part of the product, it's not covered. If the packaging is disposed of independently of the product, then it is considered packaging and it's subject to PPWR. What else? We have over 30 questions left here.
There's one I wanted to just quickly answer. Is there a risk that products will be held up at customs upon entry into Europe while the required documentation is being provided? So currently, the way that this is addressed in the adopted text is around the collaboration between competent authorities and customs in the event that non-compliant products are still being placed on the EU market. So if a product is found to be non-compliant, there is supposed to be a communication between the authorities in each of the member states and customs authorities to ensure that that product is held at the borders and is not allowed further entry into the EU. While what's not addressed in the adopted text or any of the guidance that I've seen so far has been whether that would be something that they're preemptively doing prior to establishing that a product is found to be non-compliant. Currently, that's really only addressed as, again, an enforcement measure to ensure that non-compliant packaging does not have a means of still entering the EU. So the answer is yes, that there would be a risk that products are held at customs. However, it would be products that have already been found, at present at least, the way this is written in the adopted text, products that have been found to be missing PPWR requirements already by competent authorities and have been found to be non-compliant.
I'm also seeing a lot of questions around the test, the robustness of the testing that needs to be included for PPWR declarations of conformity. The EU doesn't per se require testing. It requires substantiation. So there's no specific labs that have been certified to do testing for PPWR. Test results are obviously the most uh, probably one of the most robust forms of substantiation that a supplier can provide. But there are all sorts of processes and packaging that may not require that kind of testing because they don't run the risk and or they've been prepared in ways that are segregated from those materials. But there needs to be some evidence provided, some sort of substantiation beyond just a statement of compliance. So some form of evidence has to be provided and stored in order to comply with the law. But it does not have to be an independent test result from a lab.
Great. I also see a question around shipping. Do shipping labels count as branding? No, if the only element on the packaging that has your name on it is the shipping label, that would not count as branding. The way that this is defined again in the adopted text in terms of who qualifies as a manufacturer would be if you are transforming that packaging for with your branding permanently. So you've branded all of your packaging with your entities or companies branding. And that would not count as something like a removable shipping label. That's not enough to change the definition of the manufacturer. So just to answer that question quickly, that's not the way that this is defined per the adopted text.
There's another question I'll address, but I think it's been somewhat addressed. But it is absolute. So there is no declaring. So the declaration of conformity is not a declaration in the traditional sense of the word, insofar as it's actually an internal record. So the declaration of conformity is an internal declaration, right? It's not being declared to the EU that there is conformity. The EU, in an investigation, one of the countries could investigate a company and ask for these declarations of conformity at some point. So there's no declaring, and it's likely that the same packaging could have multiple declarations of conformity from multiple stakeholders in its supply chain. Someone in the supply chain could be selling the packaging directly and supplying it to someone else. And therefore, the second, the person who they're supplying it to, who then puts it on the market, would have their own declaration of conformity. So it is likely that there's redundant declarations of conformity for the same packaging. From multiple stakeholders in the supply chain. That's why we recommend asking your suppliers if they have a declaration of conformity already for the packaging, and then you can use the same information in that declaration of conformity for your declaration of conformity. But it is likely it does not mean that you no longer have to have one. It doesn't mean that you can take their signature. You have to have your own signatory. You have to be registered yourselves in the EPR or PPWR portal if you're putting it on the market. But it is true that your suppliers may have declarations of conformity and you may also have them, and they may be for the same packaging.
Great. This is a similar question to one we answered earlier. I just want to again reiterate this since I've seen this question more than once. Are importers of packaged foods also affected by the regulation? Yes, absolutely. If you are the entity placing packaged food on the EU market and that packaged food has your trademark on the packaging, so that is the qualifier. If that packaged food has your trademark on the packaging, and you are placing it on the EU market, you would still be responsible for PPWR requirements per the definitions of what would qualify an entity as the manufacturer. It is not just entities that are making packaging themselves. If you are trademarking, branding, packaging, and there's products within that packaging, you would still be considered the manufacturer in that case. The trademark and the branding is the thing that's the qualifier here.
Okay, I think we're just about at time. Um, I wanted to thank everyone who attended and all the questions we have that are still open. We'll try to answer a few more until the clock runs out. But please don't hesitate to get in touch with us. We'll be more than happy to take a call and continue the conversation on a case-by-case basis. Um, so thank you for attending, and we'll also be announcing our next webinar in the series very shortly, and we'll send a recap of this one and the invitation for the next one to everyone who registered and whose email we have.
Great. Thanks, everybody.